Hello, my name is Angela Dow, Meetings and Event Manager for HFTP. Welcome to today's webinar, Cyber Liability Insurance, 5 Reasons to Consider It. Cyber liability insurance can play an important role in your overall risk management strategy. This course will provide an overview of cyber liability insurance and 5 main reasons to purchase this type of coverage as it applies to your hotel, clubs, and golf courses. With this help of a relevant case studies, attendees will gain a better understanding of cyber liability insurance and the potential costs associated with a breach occurs. Our presenter today, Patrick Costello, is the co-founder of Evolve MGA, along with his brother Mike in 2015, which has grown tremendously with the development of the industry-leading cyber programs for the brokers and clients. As he focuses on the rapid expanding cyber insurance market, Patrick is determined to provide his brokers the tools they need to give their clients a peace of mind while addressing exposure in the modern world. Please help me welcome your presenter, Patrick Costello.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me, for taking the time today. I appreciate you hopping on. Like we said in the introduction, we are here today to talk about why the hospitality industry and why every business specifically needs cyber insurance. To give you a little bit of history on my background, I'm an insurance industry veteran with experience across multiple places in the distribution system for insurance, retail brokerage, underwriter, wholesaler. I grew up in the family business in the insurance industry, and so what I can tell you guys right now is that cyber insurance is the newest form of commercial insurance that's currently available. And what we've done with Evolve, which was founded about 3 years ago, is we decided that we wanted to specialize only in cyber liability insurance because there's a massive deficit of understanding within the industry as to why any business needs cyber insurance, but there's also a massive deficit in coverage when you look across the industry and you look at maybe an AIG cyber policy versus a Philadelphia policy versus a policy that's backed by Lloyd's of London. So there's a huge difference in the types of coverage that's currently available. The majority of markets actually offer relatively limited coverage just because the insurance market is scrambling to figure out how they can cover these exposures. So essentially what we did with Evolve was we try to set ourselves up to provide the most value that we possibly can to retail insurance brokers and their clients. And so we actually work with a brokerage called G2. Joel Brand is the representative from G2 who I work with directly that specializes in hospitality. And so he is an expert at going through major exposures for the hospitality industry and getting hospitality clients coverage they actually need when it comes to cyber insurance. And he and I worked together a lot to put these programs together for hospitality companies. So that's a quick background. Again, at Evolve, literally all we do is cyber insurance. So I'm fired up today to give you guys some background on exactly why the hospitality industry needs it, the exposures they need to look out for. And so what I'm going to plan on doing today is going through, first, the evolution of crime in general, because there's a huge difference between what crime used to look like maybe in the early 1900s versus what it looks like now. And there's a lot of different incentives towards what a criminal could potentially be going after in today's age versus in the age of bank robbers, which is really interesting. The next thing I want to go through is the direct hospitality exposures that firms face on a daily basis based on information they're collecting, technology they're using, and what it might cost if your business is to go down for a certain amount of time, right? So once we go through those major exposures, then I want to go through some direct claims examples. We actually see multiple claims on a daily basis in just about every industry, but the hospitality industry has some unique exposures that make it more advantageous, it make it look a little bit more attractive from a hacker's perspective. And then after we go through some claims examples, we'll go through what you want in a cyber policy, because like I said, there's a big deficit in coverage today. The majority of domestic carriers are heavily sublimiting coverage. I want you guys to know exactly what coverage you need to look out for. what coverage you'd actually want in the cyber policy. And then finally, we can go into some next steps in terms of what you should be doing around your IT security, what you should be looking for in a broker or someone that could potentially get you the best cyber policy out there. And then finally, we can go into some questions. But without further ado, I would love to get into one of my favorite parts of this presentation, which is talking about crime. On your guys' screen, you guys are going to see the faces of 3 criminals and the amount of money that they were able to steal in their lifetimes. All of these guys that you guys are looking at currently were well known for their ability to rob banks. As you can see, they stole a significant amount of money in their lifetimes. One other major common thread is that they all suffered horrible demises, and they all suffered some sort of prison time as well. So I want to contrast that with modern day criminals and hacking groups. So this guy on your left, Albert Gonzalez, was actually able to steal 170 million credit cards in 9 years. To give you guys an idea of the value of what he stole, credit cards on average go for about $5 on the dark web. So he stole the equivalent of $850 million. So keep in mind that the criminals shown previously, they faced life in prison if caught after robbing a bank. Albert Gonzalez received a 20-year sentence, which was the longest sentence given out to date for a hacking-related crime. So it's just really interesting to break down the differences because it's far more lucrative to be a criminal from the hacking perspective because there's no threat of direct physical harm. You don't need to walk into a bank. You don't need to use a weapon. You can be in another country. The regulatory consequences for hackers are not fully developed. And you can get far, far, far more value in what you're stealing. So that's more missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to hacking versus bank robbery. To give you guys an idea of how often hacking occurs, ransomware was actually reported to the Department of Justice every 40 seconds in the fourth quarter of 2017. So the scary thing is we've only seen a large increase in hacking, as we know from our detailed claims handling experience and the sophistication of the hacks that we see on a regular basis. It's honestly incredibly shocking. But the 2 other groups you guys are going to see on the slide are organized cybercrime groups like you may have heard of the Shadow Crew, the Legion of Doom, Masters of Deception, all very creative names. But these are organized crime groups that will consist of multiple individuals that will go after certain organizations. A lot of times they have social motivations, political motivations, to try and take down certain organizations or steal large amounts of money from certain organizations. So the final one is state actors. I'm sure you guys have heard of this. Be it Russia and North Korea are consistently in the news for cyber attacks. A lot of you guys may have seen the movie called The Interview with Seth Rogen and James Franco. This was a movie that spurred an attack on Sony Studios, which was incredibly devastating to that particular studio because not only did they destroy basically all of the software and the data and the ability for everyone in the company to get work done, they actually released a ton of very controversial executive emails that resulted in the chairman of the board having to step down, and enormous costs in rectifying all that data, getting new systems, getting back online, and the reputational harm from it alone was massive. So these are kind of the 3 newer type of criminals that a lot of people aren't necessarily too concerned about or scared of, but when you see the numbers that these guys are hitting in terms of the devastation, the costs, and taking businesses down and the loss of profit, it's enormous. So I'm glad I was able to break down the differences between how criminals used to operate and how criminals are currently operating. And this sort of crime is still developing. But what I would love to do now is go through the major exposures that hospitality companies face. And there are really two buckets of exposure that hospitality companies face. I think that for this particular slide, it's actually in PowerPoint format, so you guys aren't going to be able to see what's behind this hacker's face. But if I were able to make it work the way I planned on it, you would see two buckets of information, right? There's two major costs associated with getting hacked or losing data, right? There's liability, major liability associated with negligence and losing information, right? A lot of people will bring suit against you for not handling their data correctly, or maybe you caused them financial harm based on a hacking attack, and now they want to go after you and sue you, right? And the other major bucket of cost is what we call first-party costs. So you get hacked and you have to deal with the direct expenses associated with that hacking attack. So maybe you have to pay a legal firm to draft notices to notify every single third party that was involved in the hacking attack. Or maybe you have to bring in a forensics firm to come in and fix all of your systems. Or maybe you have to bring in a third-party firm to come in and rebuild all your data, right? So those are all examples of first-party costs, and I'll get into more examples. But I want to go through that first bucket I mentioned where you have lost or stolen information because there is direct value associated with information. Hackers a lot of times can sell information on the dark web for a profit. And what I want to do now before I get into the details of this information to test you guys to see, first of all, if you guys are paying attention, and also to get an idea of your understanding of the value of different types of information. So right now we have our question slide, which I think Brian will help me see what the audience thinks. But the question is, what type of information is not relevant to cyber insurance? Protected health information, PHI, personal banking details, PBD, personally identifiable information, PII, and payment card information, PCI. Okay, so it looks like 86% says PHI is not relevant to cyber insurance. Looks like it's gone down to about 70. Looks like we have some fluctuating information, but it does seem like protected health information may be the largest topic. Let's see, I'll give it a couple seconds to see if anyone wants to change or update their answer. Okay, so it looks like around 53%, maybe let's just say 50% people say PHI, protected health information. The ironic part of this question is actually protected health information is the most valuable form of information that currently exists. I'll get into details in a slide later on, but this actually is one of the massive elements associated with cyber insurance, because not only are healthcare organizations collecting lots and lots of patient records that are extremely full, so you know, it's going to have your social security number, it's going to have your medical history, it's going to have your address, your email address, your phone number. So it's going to have an extremely full idea of your information. And so when you have a cyber policy, you want to make sure that PHI, protected healthcare information, is listed specifically within the policy. But when you look at these other types of information that I included on here, personal banking details, personally identifiable information, payment card information, the industry term that is most commonly used in cyber insurance is personally identifiable information. This is actually defined by every single state because every single state requires you to notify in the event that you lose third-party information. And so states will define personally identifiable information. The most general definition that we have for PII is any type of information that can be linked back to an individual. So it's super general, super vague, and so that means if I have someone's phone number and it can be linked back to an individual, I have personally identifiable information. The other piece of information I want to explain on here is payment card information, PCI. This is enormous to have, and the hospitality industry is uniquely exposed to this because there's so many organizations that are accepting credit cards and debit cards. This is a huge point that you have to make sure is included in cyber insurance. But the one answer on here that is not relevant to cyber insurance is, it was kind of a trick question, is personal banking details, because that would actually fall under personally identifiable information. So now that we've gone through the question, I want to go through and break down each type of information so you guys can learn not only about how it works, but the value associated with that information. I mentioned PII, PCI, PHI. These are all things you want to make sure are included within a cyber policy because they're all super, super valuable, and these are all things that hackers will target directly. So the first one I want to go through, like I said, is PII, and I'll give you the California definition. It's any piece of information that can be linked back to an individual, like I said. There's common examples you're going to see on the left. There's massive costs that you're going to see on the right, and a lot of times this is going to build up based on how many records of information that you're holding on individuals. So the first thing that you're going to have to do when you lose this type of information is you're going to have to bring in a data breach attorney, right? Just because you're required by state to notify. And let's just say you're a hotel, you're going to have to notify people based on the state that they are domiciled in. So for instance, if I'm in California and I go and visit Kentucky and stay in a hotel in Kentucky, that hotel is going to have to notify based on California law, right? So you're going to have to bring in, again, a data breach attorney that's going to have to figure out every single state's laws and figure out how to notify based on those specific states' laws, right? After you notify everyone, there's chance of liability ensuing from that notification. There could be a class action lawsuit. You could have less customers come to your hotel based on them hearing about the data breach, right? You could be fined by regulatory authorities, right? The FCC is a great example of someone that came in and they fined Wyndham Hotels over $5 million because they lost a very minimal amount of information in the Wyndham Hotel data breach. I think it was under 500,000 records. So massive costs associated with PII. This is something that every hospitality company is collecting. It's really important to know about. And then what I want to go through next is just some quick calculations on what this might look like when this information is lost. So I mentioned the notification costs. On average, you can see it's about $3 per employee and customers. You also have to bring in a forensic analyst firm, which is really expensive as well. A lot of times we say in the industry that they're getting more expensive than attorneys because you have to figure out how much information was actually lost, right? You have a responsibility and a duty to the third parties that you collect their information on. So that's enormous. Then you're going to have the fallout from people realizing that you weren't protecting your systems, protecting their data well. So you have to bring in a PR firm. I mentioned the legal advice as well in terms of making sure everyone's notified, making sure the appropriate vendors and bodies are notified, reputational harm associated, and then potentially a class action lawsuit, right? So this is just a sample loss of personally identifiable information. What's even more expensive to lose is credit card information, right? We call this PCI, the payment card industry or payment card information. This is huge because this is an element of personally identifiable information as well. But the issue here is you are subject to the PCI board. The PCI board is the combination of the major credit card companies that set up rules for merchant banks to give out their credit cards to individuals. So the liability here is built around contracts between merchant banks and then merchants in between, that merchant bank dealing with the merchant directly. So if you lose credit card information, if someone hacks you and steals a bunch of credit card information, you can be subject to 3 major buckets of cost. First one is the PCI board has the ability to fine you up to $500,000. That's the first thing. The second thing is you are going to have to pay you have to pay to reissue every single credit card that was lost. MasterCard came out recently and said, on average, this is going to be about $7 per credit card. So if you multiply 7 by the amount of transactions you had per year, that's going to be a fraction of the cost associated with that data breach. And then at the end of the day, the fraud is an X factor. You don't know how quickly the fraud is going to be caught, or how quickly those credit cards might be sold in the dark web. But if there is fraud, it's very likely you're going to be subject to 100% of that fraud. So again, just want to run through some quick calculations. You're going to see some common themes between losing all this type of information, some common things that you need to do in every single breach of information. But specifically in the payment card industry situation, you have to bring in professionals that are experienced and understand how to deal with payment card systems. And so you have to bring in specific payment card forensic analysts. You're going to have to deal again with those specific PCI fines and penalties. And then you have those costs associated. Again, $7 per credit card that you have to reissue, the X factor of fraud costs. And then you have all the costs associated that we talked about in the personally identifiable information loss. So as you can see, it's way more expensive to lose credit cards than it is just to lose general personally identifiable information. And then finally, and this doesn't necessarily apply directly to the hospitality industry, but if you are holding any protected healthcare information, again, there's huge costs associated with that, and it's a massive target, right? Hackers want that information because the industry in healthcare is, when you're dealing with health information, it's not as regulated as the credit card industry, because the credit card industry is super used to catching fraud as quickly as it possibly can, but the healthcare industry is not, and people that are handling healthcare information are not as well. So the next thing I want to go through is that second bucket I talked about, first-party costs, the costs that you have to deal with when you get hacked, right? This is we probably see these claims, the mass frequency of these claims in terms of the entire spectrum that we see of claims. This probably makes up 75% of the bulk of those claims. So the number one way hackers steal information is human error. You wouldn't believe how many times we see an employee clicking on a phishing link that they shouldn't be clicking on. So before we jump into this bucket, this major topic of exposure, we have a quick question. So we have a sample first-party cost hacking attack, and I want to see if you guys are able to figure out which situation this is describing. So this is a subset of malware in which the data on a victim's computer is locked, typically by encryption, and payment is demanded before the ransom data is decrypted and access returned to the victim. I'll give it a second. Yeah, it looks like we have 13 for ransomware so far. All right. Looks like we have almost 20 for ransomware. So, love it. Everyone is 100% correct, and I'm very glad that everyone got this answer. Like I said, in the fourth quarter of 2017, it was reported to the Department of Justice every 40 seconds. So I would say we'd probably see at least one or two of these claims every single day. It's to the point where we've actually seen, you don't have to be what you would imagine as your typical cyber hacker to send out ransomware attacks. You can literally go on the dark web, you can download ransomware, and you can send it out to whoever you want. We actually saw a scenario where we ran into a ransomware broker. So this person was giving out ransomware on the dark web for free and just taking a commission of every single ransom that was paid out to him. So it's huge. So the top two attacks that we're seeing on a daily basis when we talk about first-party costs that you experience directly, right? You're not dealing with a third party suing you or making a claim against you or coming at you for whatever reason, are ransomware and wire transfer fraud. First thing, again, I'll go into details of ransomware, and I want to show you guys an example of some ransomware attacks that we've seen. A lot of times we will see these ransomware attacks be put into zip files, and a lot of times people will pretend that there's some sort of invoice that hasn't been paid. That's a really common example. A lot of times hackers will pose as large companies. We actually, internally, we just got one that looked like it was supposed to be from eBay. This is an example that you're seeing of someone pretending to be Amazon, right? And so you'll have a link or an attachment that you'll be clicking on. Actually, in 2017, there was 2 global ransomware attacks that occurred, WannaCry and NotPetya. I'm not sure if anyone experienced those, but those actually caused global damage. And what hackers are looking for in these scenarios is typically an employee to click on something, or they're looking for something within a system that is probably not updated, or they find some sort of vulnerability in the system. WannaCry, again, if you guys type in WannaCry on Google, you will find tons of articles about how it devastated tons of companies. But the issue there was a lot of people hadn't updated their Microsoft software, and so that made their systems far more vulnerable than it would have if you had someone that was regularly updating their systems. So ransomware is enormous, but another huge thing that I want to bring up is something called social engineering. I don't know if you guys have heard of social engineering. It's also referred to as wire transfer fraud, but as you guys can see from the definition that's listed on your screen, this is basically someone duping you into getting your personal information and using that against you to get someone to perform some sort of fraudulent wire transfer. It's incredibly lucrative for hackers, right? Because it's one shot, it's incredibly sophisticated a lot of times when we see it come through. We see a lot of people impersonating full-on email signatures and creating fake correspondences. A lot of times they'll pose as the CEO, who will then, and they'll email the CFO, try and get the CFO to transfer a large amount of money to a specific bank account. Typically we see CFOs or management, C-suite executives, people with that look to have the ability to have the authority to transfer this type of money. And also we see a lot of vendors that are targeted in this sense. I want to show you guys a real claims example that hit home for us, because this was with a company that we work with down the street, actually. And this email is actually from the from a CFO that's emailing the CEO, who wanted to confirm with the CEO that a wire transfer a wire transfer request was legitimate. And this is actually a very real life example that we experienced. That was coming from this email that was from me, was actually from a hacker that was emailing specifically the CFO. So you guys will see as this progresses. The CFO, who just wants to confirm that this is a legitimate transfer, he's confirming that there's available balances, or he wants to know exactly what's going on within the type of account, the balance going on. The CEO just is looking for the balances of the total trust and operating. This is a criminal that's just looking to figure out how much money he can get from a specific bank account. This is the CFO's response. Gives him exactly what the hacker's looking for, right? And then the hacker, posing as the CEO, says, "This looks great. I'll be requesting a wire transfer out tomorrow." the great thing that happened here was the CFO called the CEO while he was on vacation to make sure that he actually wanted a wire transfer a wire transfer request. The CEO picked up the phone while he was on vacation. He's like, you know what? I have no idea what you're talking about. Do not transfer any money, and it stopped right there. So that is called dual factor authentication. That's something that we recommend every time there's some sort of transfer that's large that's going on within a company internally, or it's happening with a specific vendor. So that's huge. But again, these claims, we see these happen on a very regular basis, and people assume like, oh, if I'm a legitimate company, I have all these protocols, procedures in place. We've actually seen major claims examples with companies like Google, Facebook, massive companies that end up transferring money to all sorts of third parties. But what I want to do now, guys, is I want to go through some real-life claims examples that have been publicized, that are in the news. And the first one I want to start off with is Hilton. Hilton had 2 data breaches that exposed more than 350,000 credit card numbers, about 360,000 credit card numbers. So as you can imagine, the costs associated with losing credit card information are enormous. And a lot of times what exactly a hotel or any sort of company that's paying out in the scenario, a lot of times those costs aren't publicized. But what was publicized in this instance is the fine associated with losing that credit card information. They're fined by the federal government $700,000 and forced to upgrade all of their IT security. Right? So that is not only $700,000, that's all those upgrade costs that are built in as well. Right? So that's a huge claims example. Another big claims example that I find really interesting is an Austrian hotel that was the victim of a ransomware attack in February. So one of the biggest costs here was business interruption, because they were actually unable to issue room keys to the clients that were coming in. And because they were so freaked out by this attack, and they were so caught up in the fact that they couldn't process people coming in, they actually ended up paying the ransom in Bitcoin to the hackers, which you wouldn't believe how many times people do this to get their systems back online. But that extortion cost can range. And in this case, they ended up actually paying out that cost, and they actually suffered a loss from being down. Another huge example is Intercontinental Hotels. They had malware infected in the registers of 1,200 locations. The locations were Holiday Inns and Crown Plazas, and hackers were actually able to steal the credit and debit card information for everyone that was going to that hotel in a 3-month period. So you can get an idea of, if you just figure out how many transactions you're performing on a daily basis, how many credit cards they were able to get their hands on, and then if you include the cost associated with the potential fine, with the reissuance of all those credit cards, with the fraud associated with those credit cards, and then also with the general data breach cost of, you have to notify every single person that was a victim of that attack, or you have to bring in a forensics firm to figure out how many people's information you lost. You have to bring in a PR firm to figure out how you're going to deal with the reputational harm associated with the hacking attack, right? So the costs in a lot of these situations are not known to the public, but you can imagine how high they're going to get. The last one I want to mention is a hotel called Rosen Hotels, and it was hit by malware on their payment network for over 17 months. So they had to pay massive fines based on their deals with their merchant banks and their credit cards. I know Amex's fine alone was $128,000. They had to pay, in this specific claims example, all of these costs are public. So if you look up the Rosen Hotel attack, you'll find these. But they had to pay $50,000 in attorney's fees. They had to pay $40,000 in notification costs. They had to pay $15,000 for a PR firm, and they had to pay $150,000 in forensic costs. So the costs are huge, and I'm happy to go into any sort of those costs when we get into the questions and answer sections. But what I want to do now that we've talked about, how crimes evolve, how you look at specific exposures within the hospitality industry, and real-life claims examples, I want to go into cyber insurance, and if that's something that can help you guys mitigate the exposure of getting hacked, because hacks are only increasing because devices are only getting more and more connected to the internet, right? And so when something's connected to the internet, this is really important for you guys to know, when something is connected to the internet, it has the potential to be hacked. So what you guys need to make sure you're doing is not only making sure you have some sort of IT set up in place to defend against whatever hacks could potentially occur based on the information you're collecting and the technology you're using, but you have to know that we've seen the most sophisticated and complicated IT systems, cybersecurity networks breached. It doesn't matter how good your IT security is. You need to have a safety net. We've seen some of the most sophisticated companies in the world get these policies. We've actually written policies for some of the largest companies in the world. And so, do quality cyber policies exist? The answer is yes, and the cyber insurance market is something that's developing. To give you guys a few stats, we call it the modern day employment practices because it's something that people equate to with EPL all the time, employment practices liability. Right now, the market is around $4 billion in what people pay for cyber insurance for their business. About 30% of the market buys. 2018, excuse me, that was 2017. At the end of 2018, we expect to be around $6 billion in total premium bound, but by 2020, the market's expected to be around $20 billion, just based on the development of hacking attacks, the realization of industries around their major exposures for hacking and data breaches. And just to give you guys an idea of like what the minimum cost for a cyber policy is, it's going to depend based on your revenue, but the minimum premium for cyber insurance, at least for us, is going to be around $1,000. And so when you're like, okay, what do I need in a cyber insurance policy? Is this something that really applies to me? Well, I can tell you exactly what you need. You're going to want quality first-party coverage, right? I mentioned the first-party cost section, that first-party cost bucket, right? The cost that I'm expected to pay out from someone hacking me directly, not from some third party coming against me and claiming negligence. So the major first-party costs that you want at full limits, because cyber carriers will try and supplement these specific types of coverage. You want to make sure you talk to your broker, you figure out that these are at full limits, but you talk about IT costs, right? Because you're going to need to pay those out directly to figure out, how you get your system back online if you get hacked, right? If you pay a ransomware attack like that Austrian hotel, that extortion cost, you want to make sure you have that at full limits. General cyber crime, right, like wire transfer fraud, you want to make sure you have social engineering coverage at the highest limits you could possibly have, right? Business interruption is an enormous cost associated with hacking attacks, because if you get hacked and your systems go down, how much profit are you going to lose per day, right? It's a huge cost. And if you do go down, how many customers are you going to lose based on, the reputational harm of that specific hacking attack occurring? How many customers are you that would have probably come and worked with you in the coming year, but they just heard about this hack, so they're actually going to go to someone else. They're going to deal with someone else, right? You're going to have to pay the notification. If you lose credit cards, you're going to have to pay credit monitoring. You could potentially be fined, and it's very likely you're going to have to bring in a PR firm. So, again, you want to make sure these are at full limits. But before we jump into some of the highlights of cyber coverage that you guys should be thinking about, I want to go into one more question. And the question is based around ransomware, and it's what is typically the largest cost in a ransomware attack? Does anyone have an idea? Right? We have forensics, we have legal fees, business interruption, we have reputational harm. I mentioned that forensics is about $350 per hour. When you have to bring one of these firms in, a lot of times they're charging more than attorneys. Attorneys are always going to be expensive, so those legal costs are going to be high. Reputational harm can be a little bit of an X factor, as can business interruption. I'll let the polls come in and let you guys see if you want to update any of your answers. I'll give it a couple seconds. So it looks like, as of now, the majority of folks are clicking on business interruption. And I have to say that's awesome, because that is totally correct. Business interruption is typically the highest cost we see in these ransomware attacks, because businesses are not able to operate the way that they're used to operating, the way that they typically operate. And a huge topic within cyber insurance today, I'm going to skip down, it's actually number 3 in the hot topics for cyber insurance slide, full continued business interruption. I know that a lot of you guys are relying on third-party vendors to perform your services. I know that we are internally. We use, a customized Salesforce platform. We use the cloud. We use different sort of softwares to manage HR. We are dealing with different vendors for benefits, things like that. We're relying on third parties all the time to get our business done. And one thing that's huge that you want to make sure is in a cyber policy is that you have contingent or dependent business interruption at full limits. What this means is if the third party that you're depending on goes down and you can't operate, you have coverage for your business interruption. Right? So that's a huge topic. Another big topic in the cyber insurance world is called each and every claim trigger. So the way cyber policies work is you typically have an aggregate amount that the total amount that you're going to spend in a policy period, right? But if you remove that aggregate on first-party coverage, what that means is you have a certain amount allotted for every single different attack that occurs in a policy period. So, for example, if you have $1 million policy, you have $1 million for every different claim that comes in the policy period. Whereas if you had an aggregate, you'd only have $1 million total. So it's way more money to play around with. So you want to make sure that you have an each and every claim trigger in there. You want to make sure you have a separate tower for incident response costs. So these are all the forensic costs, the legal costs, the immediate response to a hacking attack, just because those forensic costs can rack up really quickly, and you don't want to erode that limit right away. So you want to make sure you have a separate tower for those. That's a key thing. Another thing that I want to mention is you guys have probably heard of the Equifax data breach. This was a really interesting scenario because the majority of other insurance policies have not developed around cyber insurance. So D&O, for example, will do a lot of things when it comes to cyber insurance. It may exclude cyber triggers. It may include a small cyber supplement. It may be totally silent on whether they're covering cyber triggers. So what you want to do in these scenarios is make sure that coverage is specifically defined. And so having a cyber policy that includes D&O based on a cyber attack, and D&O is directors and officers. So basically, if someone sues the management of a company based on you not protecting their data correctly, or you not protecting the shareholders' information, or you not putting the right policies and procedures in place because it's your responsibility as the management of the company to do so, you can be the victim of a large lawsuit, and that's exactly what happened in the Equifax scenario. And so you want a cyber policy that has D&O coverage built in, aka management liability coverage built in, based on cyber triggers. And the final thing is, because we see social engineering and wire transfer fraud happen all the time, you want to make sure that that coverage is in there at the highest possible limit. And you also want to make sure that you have theft of personal funds coverage in there, because we see a lot of C-suite level executives doing their personal banking in the office, and a lot of these C-suite executives are targeted based on their title. So if someone puts keylogging malware on someone's system, it's very easy for them to get your credentials and then just transfer money out of your personal bank account to whatever bank account they want. So that's a very scary scenario. But what I want to talk about now is, so these are the big topics you want to make sure that you have included in a cyber policy. But what a lot of cyber insurance programs are doing these days is coming out with free risk management tools that will kind of kickstart your IT security and your knowledge and your general protection for your company around, how you're managing this risk. it's almost like the sprinkler would be to your home, but you're still buying a homeowner's insurance policy. So what these risk management services will do, like for instance, a company like BitSite could come in and they would analyze every facet of your IT security, how you're handling your data, and they'll give you letter grades and show you exactly what you need to do to improve your IT security, right? It'll help you or give you the ability to consult with a forensic analyst who's seen a lot of claims and can show you exactly what sort of software you should be implementing. Because phishing is such a common attack we see, for instance, we have the ability to give out like this specialized phishing tool, which will basically see which employees are clicking on what phishing links that will be very detrimental to the company, and then give them training based on what they clicked on. An incident response plan builder, these are super common because you want to just make sure, this is really key, because you want to make sure someone has the responsibility on their shoulders to understand what the company is going to do if they're the victim of a hacking attack or a data breach. Making sure that response is there. And then another quick example is RepNight, which is a tool that will search the dark web to see if you have any sort of third-party information or company information that's floating around out there that's being sold. So these are really common amongst cyber carriers, and I would definitely recommend taking advantage of them because they're usually totally free. For instance, we've leveraged all these relationships, and so what you'll see on the next screen is an example of a BitSite report with all the letter grades and show you where you are in terms of your industry. But again, what you really want to ask for from your brokers in these scenarios, like next steps, if you're like, okay, I think I need to consider cyber insurance, which everyone needs to be doing based on what the hacks that we're seeing. You want to figure out what's in a good cyber policy versus a bad cyber policy, and a way to test your broker, because even brokers are still developing on this. I say Joe Brand is an expert when it comes to this, is determining what's in a good cyber policy versus a bad cyber policy and doing a full wording comparison. It's a full-on contractual analysis that'll break down, again, what's good versus what's bad. This is something that you should be requesting from your broker. And again, in terms of next steps, I think the first thing that everyone should be doing is making sure you have some sort of IT relationship in place in case you don't understand where your exposures are in terms of being hacked, in terms of losing data. But the next thing I think you guys need to do is determine if you have coverage, because you may already have coverage, you're not sure about it. But then it's an ideal scenario to get in touch with a broker that's experienced in the space, that can understand exactly where your exposures are, that can talk with you and represent your interests. Get a cyber application completed so you can get the best cyber insurance that's available, and that's what your broker will do. He'll look into, or he or she will look into quotes for high quality coverage. But that really covers the majority of what we're talking about. Glad I was able to go through the development of crime and cybercrime specifically, major exposures, specific hacking attacks that we see all the time and how they affect hospitality industry directly. But now would love to open it up to any questions that the audience has.
Thanks, Patrick. Just as a reminder to the audience, if you'd like to ask Patrick a question in the next 10 minutes or so, go ahead and make sure you're using that Q&A tab in your interface. We did have a couple of questions come in, Patrick, and the first one is, hospitality software doesn't retain credit card information, so what exactly are they stealing?
So that's a great question, because a lot of people that are accepting credit card information are using third-party payment processors, right? PayPal is an example, Braintree, there's tons of payment card processors out there. The issue with utilizing these third-party payment card processors is that contractually, 100% of the time, we've seen them push liability back onto the merchants that they're working with. So, for example, I mentioned those three major buckets, the credit card reissuance, the potential to be fined, the fraud costs associated, and then just the general cost of notifying all those third parties. Those contracts will push all the liability back onto the merchants in the event that credit card information is lost. So I would say that's something that you would want to I personally, if I were in a hospitality organization, I would figure out my contract with my payment card process, have my broker review the liability, and then figure out how that liability is falling, because I can guarantee that payment card processor does not have the ability to take on that many costs associated with, because you can think, if I'm a payment card processor, I'm collecting hundreds, thousands, or maybe even millions of people's credit card information. If I lose all that information, my liability is through the roof. I would go bankrupt if I had the potential to take on all that liability. That's why they push it all back. So that's the scenario that you need to be concerned about with losing credit card information, even if your specific hospitality software isn't specifically collecting that credit card information, because you are the one that's dealing in credit cards and you are the merchant, you are going to be liable.
For that answer. The next question is, if my hotel is part of a major franchise like Choice or Marriott, do I need to worry about cyber insurance? Doesn't the brand cover me? If I am an independent hotel using Oracle Hospitality as my PMS, do I need my own cyber insurance, or does Oracle handle this for me?
So I first of all have to apologize here, because there isn't a standard answer to this question. And I know that for a fact, because we've both worked with multiple franchisors and franchisees, and the market's still developing around here. I mean, it's a little bit scary, because a lot of times when you're dealing with like a franchise, and you're dealing with a Choice or a Marriott, it's even scarier because you have the potential for that organization to be basically aggregating all of the information on all of your customers. That's the first major exposure. But there isn't a standard as to, okay, because I'm with Marriott, I know for a fact that they have a cyber policy in place that's covering me. That's something I would definitely talk about with your broker. And with the franchisor specifically. A lot of times these deals are going to come down to contract. But I can say, again, we've dealt with major franchisors across the country, a lot of name brand franchisors, and we found that they haven't had any sort of cyber insurance in place. So I would say, yes, this is something that you want to at least check and make sure, because there is a chance that, Marriott has some sort of cyber insurance program in place where they're allowing all their members to buy in. But a lot of times, either you have to proactively buy in, or you have to buy it on your own. So either way, you have to take that proactive step to make sure that you have some sort of coverage in place. So I think that pretty much covers that question, because in terms of Oracle Hospitality as the PMS, again, I think that the key there is you have to be proactive. You have to reach out to Oracle and see if that's covered, because if it's not, and it's likely it's not, you could be massively exposed.
Thanks, Patrick. Next question is, how much internal labor can typically be covered, and what's the typical way to show the hours used for an incident, or what would you recommend for these questions?
So the way that it's not limited to a certain amount of hours. It's just limited to whatever policy that you buy for cyber insurance. So, for example, you can buy as tall of a tower of cyber insurance as you want. I know internally we can give up to $10 million in limits, and so potentially that labor could go up to whatever limit that you're buying based on the specific hacking attack scenario. I can give you a great claims example, because we had to pay almost a full limit out for a firm that had all of their data deleted, and we had to have experts come in and recreate all of that data, which took a ton of extra time, ton of extra cost, ton of extra brain power, and that's what was the largest cost in that data breach. So basically, it's a case-by-case scenario, but you want to make sure you're buying adequate limits. And when you're looking at what limit to buy, you can go online, and if you type in data breach calculator, you can kind of get an idea of what exposure you're looking at. I know on our website we have one specifically listed. If you go to evolvemga.com, you'll see in the resources section there's a data breach calculator that can give you an idea of where your exposure is.
Another question is, are paper records typically covered by cyber policies?
Yes, yes. That's a common misconception in the cyber insurance world when people are thinking it's just because paper isn't associated with the word cyber. But the way that cyber policies has evolved is they cover, like I mentioned, data breaches. And data breaches can happen in paper formats, and they can happen in electronic formats. And so some cyber policies will not cover paper records. They'll exclude those. But I'd say from the majority of what I've seen, I know for our cyber policy in particular, we cover paper records.
The next question is, what is the application process like to get a cyber quote?
The application process varies across the industry, and a lot of times you'll have these large domestic carriers, like for instance, if you're filling out an AIG or Philadelphia or Chubb's cyber app, I don't mean to throw them under the bus, but they typically have incredibly long cyber applications that ask tons and tons of detailed IT-related questions. And I know, like for us, for example, we're very different from the majority of the industry. We have a far, far shorter application that basically asks how much people are investing in their IT security and, what they've done to mitigate certain exposures. And we basically want to figure out if this exposure is something that's on their mind and it's something that they're actively thinking about and it's something they've actually put some sort of protocol or procedure in place to protect against. So our application, we have 2 apps depending on your revenue size, but it's only 2 pages, so it's incredibly short compared to the rest of the industry because it's not uncommon to see like 10-page cybersecurity applications. The reason why ours is so short is because we've seen so many hacks result from phishing. And that's something that you can't really defend against with, the best IT security system in the world. So we love to know that people are investing in it because it does help. But at the end of the day, we don't find it worth it to ask 100 questions about how many firewalls you have installed. Just because a lot of times this stuff gets pushed back onto the IT person within the company, and he's confused as to why you're considering cyber insurance, and it goes back and forth from there. And so the short answer is there are some firms, cyber insurance firms, that have basically made that cyber application process far easier than others. And so if you guys are ever interested in seeing our apps, that's something that's totally fine. I'm happy to send it to you.
It looks like we have time for one more question. And the question is, how often do you see ransomware attacks?
We see 1 to 2 a day in just about every industry out there. And I'll leave you guys with one quick claims example. We said a catering company that you wouldn't expect to be a target of a ransomware attack, but they had multiple trucks that were going to multiple locations, and they had this attack that took down all of their systems. And logistics is a huge issue when it comes to ransomware because if you're communicating with third parties to get certain things done at certain times, again, that business interruption is a massive cost. But this really small catering company had costs that went up into the millions based on this specific ransomware attack. And again, all their data and all their information was gone. So a lot of times you have to rectify all of that data. You have to pay the business interruption. You have to upgrade the systems. And so, again, it's scary how often those ransomware attacks are happening. And it's something that I think every business needs to be concerned about.
Patrick, we are out of time for today. So on behalf of HFTP, I would like to thank you all for attending today's program. Also a big thank you to Patrick for sharing his expertise with us. This does conclude our presentation, and you may now disconnect.